In 1939, Germany invaded Poland and started the beginning of one of the world's worst wars, World War II. France and Great Britain quickly came to support their ally Poland through this invasion, but the German forces were too strong, and within a month, Poland was under Germany's control. Soon the entanglement of alliances caused this war to spread. The war started in Europe, but advanced throughout much of the world. In 1941, America was attacked by the Japanese forces in the territory of Hawaii. America had been able to avoid conflict until this tragic attack on Pearl Harbor. After the loss of approximately 2,000 people, the United States only had one choice left. With the approval of Congress, America declared war on Japan and joined the Allied forces in an attempt to bring justice for their country. 16 million men served, but this crisis of war would soon bring the question of women in the armed forces. During World War II, women filled non-combat roles to make men available for combat duty. The support they offered led to the establishment of the Women's Armed Service Integration Act of 1948, which allowed them a permanent status in the military. Though their rights were restricted, women continued to fight to break the gender barrier in the United States military. In 1941, Edith Norris Rogers, Congresswoman from Massachusetts, proposed a bill to establish the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. This bill would allow 25,000 women to fill non-combat positions such as clerical jobs. This bill got much support from the Chief of Staff, George Marshall. He envisioned enrolling thousands of women to fill these jobs so men could be released from their administrative jobs and free for combat duty. Unfortunately, more pressing issues appeared in the House of Representatives, and Miss Edith's bill was languished. This did not stop Rogers. She continued to fight to break the gender barrier in the Army. She reintroduced her bill at the beginning of 1942 with not only 25,000 auxiliaries but 150,000. The bill also permitted women to have a permanent status in the military and enlist in the Army on the same basis as men. Much controversy was received on this bill. People could support the idea of allowing women to release men from administrative duty, but the House believed allowing women a permanent status in the military would destroy the foundations of America's society. On May 4, 1942, Congress approved the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, but did not grant them military status. President Roosevelt signed the bill into an act the next day, establishing Public Law 77-554. Texas native who served as Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, Oveta Cope Hobby, was selected director of the WAAC and took oath on May 16, 1942. Because the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was not granted military status, Ms. Oveta Hobby and her staff had to establish the WAAC regulations that would govern appointments, enlistments, discipline, training, uniforms, pay, and discharge. After the regulations were made and the bill was signed, the first training center was opened at Fort Des Moines, Iowa. Colonel Don Faith was appointed to command the center. The first group of women arrived at Fort Des Moines July 20, 1942. Soon the WAAC would surpass the initial recruitment goal and training center capacity they had set for that year. Training centers were opened at Daytona Beach, Florida, Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, Fort Devens, Massachusetts, and Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The recruitment goal jumped from 25,000 to 150,000 within the next year. Hostile attitudes began to grow with the rise in numbers. Slanderous campaigns began to start about the WAAC, and many jokes were heard from within the Army itself. These unpleasant attitudes did not keep the WAAC from increasing status. In 1943, General Marshall asked Congress to allow the WAAC military status. Women were unable to receive overseas pay, government life insurance, or protected under international agreements through the WAAC. Edith Rogers and Director Hobby began to draft a bill that would allow women to have a permanent status. Approved by General Marshall, the bill was introduced to Congress in January 1943. After much debate, the bill received approval by both houses and was signed by President Roosevelt on July 1, 1943. This act established the Women's Army Corps and became Public Law 78-110. This law removed the limitations on size and omitted the word auxiliary. Members of the WAC broke the gender barrier and now would receive equal pay, allowances, and benefits as men. Women filled clerical jobs and used their skills in mathematics and science for the next 2 years, making men available for combat. On September 2, 1945, the war ended and many were eager to return home. Male soldiers would return home to celebrate and await their next assignment, but the biggest question was what would happen to the Women's Army Corps. Public Law 78-110 called for the discontinuation of the WAC 6 months after the war had been declared over, so the struggle for Army and Reserve status would soon begin. President Truman had nominated General Eisenhower to take over General Marshall's position as Chief of Staff. He took office on November 19th and immediately asked for a plan to be prepared to include women in the regular Army. He had Colonel Boyce and the directors of the WAC to begin devising a plan. The group arranged 4 plans of legislation. With much deliberation and consideration, Colonel Boyce decided on Plan B, that provided for a Women's Army Reserve section in the Organized Reserve Corps for WAC commissioned officers, warrant officers, and enlisted women. This plan would not allow the Women's Army Corps to be permitted into the regular Army. In January 1946, Boyce proposed her plan to Congress. However, neither General Paul or General Eisenhower agreed with the proposed plan. On January 17th, General Paul would announce that the War Department would ask the legislation to include the WAC and post-war Army. On February 5, 1946, Chief of Staff Eisenhower would charge for the bill to be drafted that allowed the WAC in the regular Army. The WAC Integration Act of 1946 was introduced to the Senate on July 25th and to the House on the 26th. The bill died on August 2nd after Congress decided to adjourn. Deputy Director Halloran and Lieutenant Colonel Mary Louise Milligan began to revise the bill for reintroduction to the 80th Congress. On April 15, 1947, the WAC Integration Act of 1947 was introduced to Congress. The WAC would soon receive devastating news. The committee had decided to postpone the hearing for the bill until January 1948. Many women considered leaving the service, but a letter from Colonel Halloran encouraged them to stay. Finally, on May 19, 1948, House members agreed to allow women into the regular Army. On May 26, the Senate unanimously voted to approve the bill and sent it to the House. The House voted on June 2nd and passed the bill with a vote of 206 to 133 votes. President Truman signed the Women's Army Service Integration Act into law as Public Law 625 on June 12, 1948. Though their rights were restricted through this act, these women were able to break the gender barrier and fight for equality in the United States Armed Forces. They filled any non-combat job to help push men to combat. The support they offered in World War II through the Women's Army Corps led to the Women's Armed Service Integration Act. This act opened opportunities for women to continue to break barriers for gender equality. Within the next few years, women were able to eliminate involuntary discharge for pregnant service women, serve the same length tours as men, and achieve the same enlistment age as men. Without the women of the WAC, women would not have the opportunities they do today. They would not be able to serve in the military, they would not have received the same rights as men in the armed forces, and they would not make up over 20% of the military today. Because of the Women's Army Corps, these accomplishments have been made possible and opened the door for more broken barriers and gender equality.